Hey guys, tonight we're talking about revenge. Medieval revenge. Not the kind that can be fixed with apologies, hot takes, or polite letters. We're talking about a type of revenge that was patient, cold, and often spread over decades, hidden in plain sight. This is revenge through marriage alliances. The quietest weapon in medieval Europe, and sometimes the deadliest. In a world where swords could be sharpened in minutes but influence could take years to rebuild, marriage was the ultimate strategy. Noble families, royal houses, and even minor lords understood that a bride or a groom could be more powerful than an army if chosen, or withheld, with precision. Marriages were not just contracts. They were statements. They were tools. They were revenge. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example. When she married Louis VII of France, it seemed like a union of great houses, a consolidation of power, and a partnership in medieval diplomacy. On the surface, it was perfect. Beneath the surface, it was the beginning of a long, intricate dance of ambition, resentment, and eventual retribution. Eleanor's eventual annulment was not just a personal victory, it was the first step in a revenge that would shape France and England for decades. Her next marriage, to Henry II of England, was a calculated repositioning, a quiet way of asserting dominance over France by reclaiming influence in a neighboring kingdom. It was strategic. It was personal. And it was brilliant in its slow, inevitable execution. Marriage alliances worked because they relied on patience. You couldn't rush them. You couldn't force them to achieve immediate results. If a nobleman insulted a family, denied inheritance, or executed a rival, the correct response was often not to kill someone immediately. That would be crude, loud, and messy. Instead, families would arrange marriages that positioned their children, nieces, nephews, or even distant cousins in ways that gave them leverage decades later. A child born in the right castle, at the right time, to the right spouse, could inherit revenge like a legal entitlement. Consider the Habsburgs. Over generations, they married into almost every European royal house. Some marriages were carefully arranged to neutralize threats. Others were explicitly revenge, the quiet kind. A slighted duke might find his granddaughter married into the household of the man who humiliated him. Over time, property, influence, and even entire principalities could shift hands because of a single carefully timed union. And the beauty of it was that nobody could call foul immediately. Nothing broke the law. No sword crossed anyone's path. Yet centuries of grievances were being resolved without bloodshed. Almost always, the full effect was only visible decades later, when a young heiress suddenly inherited lands from an enemy family, or a distant cousin became a king. Sometimes revenge was also hidden in the timing of marriages. If one house insulted another, it could take decades before an opportunity arose for a daughter or son to marry into the offending family. By that point, the insult might be forgotten publicly, but the damage could be delivered quietly, through inheritance, influence, and carefully cultivated loyalty. In medieval politics, this patience was both art and weapon. People rarely realized they were under attack until the consequences had already been cemented. Not all revenge through marriage was subtle. Some marriages were explicitly designed to humiliate, manipulate, or diminish the target family. A widow could be forced to marry someone beneath her station, a daughter given to an enemy lord as leverage, or a son betrothed to someone who would undermine his authority at home. These arrangements were less about love, less about politics in the immediate sense, and entirely about shaping long-term outcomes. The pain was not always physical. Sometimes it was inheritance lost. Sometimes influence shifted. Sometimes reputations collapsed quietly, like a sandcastle at high tide, leaving families scrambling decades later to reclaim what had been taken. The marriage of Margaret of Anjou to Henry VI of England is a textbook example. Margaret entered a kingdom embroiled in dynastic tension, her role officially to secure peace and consolidate claims. Unofficially, her very presence was an assertion of her family's right to influence English affairs. Over time, Margaret's strategic positioning, her children, and her alliances became instruments of revenge against rival noble houses that had undermined her family. Battles were fought, yes, but the long game was played in councils, marriages, and the careful cultivation of supporters. Her revenge was generational. It was never meant to be immediate. It was meant to endure, like a slow-burning fire that could not be extinguished without effort. Revenge through marriage also relied on social perception. A family that married strategically gained legitimacy, while a family that failed to respond immediately appeared weak. In medieval Europe, appearance mattered. Reputation mattered. Losing face could be more devastating than losing a battle. Arranging marriages to humiliate an opponent, reclaim lost lands, or assert dominance sent a message that was understood by everyone in the social hierarchy. It was a statement as clear as a decapitated rival, except it cost no immediate blood, and it often had consequences far more enduring. One of the most striking examples of revenge via marriage involved the House of Lancaster and the House of York. The Wars of the Roses were a centuries-long chain reaction of insult, betrayal, and retaliation, in which marriages were used both as armistices and weapons. When a Lancastrian daughter married a Yorkist son, it was not necessarily peace. Sometimes it was strategic positioning, allowing future generations to claim thrones, lands, and titles that had once been denied. The result was revenge that spanned lifetimes, creating dynastic instability that shaped English politics for decades. Each alliance was simultaneously a truce and a calculated threat, a reminder that patience, bloodlines, and memory were just as lethal as any battlefield. The beauty of revenge through marriage was that it often avoided the immediate destruction of families and armies. Instead, it relied on slow, deliberate shifts in power. Over time, the scales tipped quietly. An insult ignored could be repaid by the birth of an heiress who married into the family that had insulted her grandmother. A stolen estate could be reclaimed when a carefully arranged marriage produced a child with legitimate claims to lands long lost. Revenge through marriage was not dramatic. It was cumulative. It worked because it was persistent, patient, and nearly invisible until the consequences became unavoidable. At its core, this type of revenge demanded extraordinary vision. Families had to anticipate decades in advance. They had to observe, record, and calculate the alliances, weaknesses, and ambitions of other households. Missteps could result in a wasted opportunity, or worse, retaliation. Every decision mattered. Every betrothal could be the difference between subtle triumph and embarrassing failure. The careful orchestration of these unions was a form of strategic patience that required understanding not just immediate relationships, but generational dynamics. Revenge through marriage could also be unexpectedly public. A marriage that elevated a family above rivals, produced heirs with claims to thrones, or reclaimed lands and titles often served as a living monument to an old grievance. The defeated family had no immediate recourse. They could complain, plot, or despair quietly, but the union itself was proof that patience and strategy had prevailed. Over time, this quiet revenge could reshape kingdoms, redraw boundaries, and rewrite history. It was enduring in a way that no single battle could ever achieve. Even when executed perfectly, this revenge was never visible in the moment. Everyone involved had to participate as if nothing was happening. The bride smiled, the groom nodded politely, and the court celebrated alliances. Meanwhile, decades of calculated vengeance were unfolding quietly, ensuring that every slight, insult, and betrayal would be paid back in ways that seemed natural, inevitable, and historically justified. By the end of the story, revenge through marriage had a dual impact. First, it served the immediate purpose of correcting past grievances, reclaiming lands, and asserting authority. Second, it created ripples that shaped generations. Political landscapes shifted. Family legacies were rewritten. Future rulers, heirs, and historians alike were forced to reckon with the consequences of unions made decades prior. The system of revenge became so intertwined with daily life that entire societies measured influence, status, and legitimacy through the marriages that families arranged in the quiet shadow of old grudges, and so, in medieval Europe, revenge was not always the flash of a sword, the clash of armies, or the public execution of enemies. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was hidden. Sometimes it moved slowly through generations like a river carving valleys, unseen until the landscape had already changed irrevocably. Revenge through marriage demanded patience, cunning, and vision. It demanded an understanding of human ambition, memory, and desire. It relied on timing, observation, and the subtle manipulation of social structures. It was enduring. It was effective. And it was, in its own way, terrifying. In the end, the children, grandchildren, and heirs born of these calculated unions were the living instruments of vengeance. They inherited not just titles, lands, and influence, but the long memory of families that refused to be ignored, humiliated, or erased. They were reminders that patience could be a weapon as sharp and unyielding as any sword. That in medieval Europe, the slow, quiet, and meticulously orchestrated acts of revenge through marriage could be more devastating than wars, sieges, or executions. And unlike the fleeting victories of battle, the consequences of these marriages could echo for centuries, rewriting history in ways that few ever noticed until it was far too late. Let's examine one of the most striking examples of revenge through marriage, the union of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Francis II of France. Mary's life was filled with betrayals, insults, and political machinations. She was imprisoned, humiliated, and constantly maneuvered around by men who assumed her youth and gender made her weak. Yet her marriage to Francis II was a calculated repositioning, a way for her family to assert influence in French and Scottish politics simultaneously. On the surface, this marriage looked like a triumph of love and diplomacy. Beneath the surface, it was a statement: Mary's family had endured insults, political losses, and outright attacks for generations, and now they had inserted their bloodline into the center of power. Through her, they would influence decisions, secure alliances, and lay the groundwork for future claims that would stretch across Europe. Every family slight, every insult, every stolen title could now be addressed quietly, strategically, through influence exerted via marriage. This was the elegance of revenge through marriage. Unlike a battlefield, where victory could be temporary and life fragile, a carefully chosen spouse created an enduring mechanism for influence. It transformed past wrongs into present power, and sometimes, into the inevitability of future revenge. Nobles and monarchs began to calculate everything decades in advance: who would marry whom, at what age, in what context, and under what pretense of alliance. They understood that the true cost of insult was often invisible, deferred until the right moment arrived to strike, not with swords, but with legitimacy, inheritance, and bloodlines. Another legendary example comes from the marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Individually, both were powerful in their own right, but together, they became the instruments of revenge and reclamation for centuries of territorial disputes, rivalries, and humiliations in Iberia. Their marriage unified kingdoms, positioned heirs strategically, and reshaped the map of Spain. Every negotiation, every arranged marriage for their children, was part of a calculated long-game strategy. Enemies who had once underestimated them found decades later that those same children held claims, titles, and lands that could not be ignored. The revenge had been executed quietly, invisibly, yet its impact reverberated for generations. The principle extended even to smaller noble houses. In northern Italy, feuds between families were often resolved, or exacerbated, through arranged marriages. A minor insult today could be addressed 30 years later by marrying the right niece into the right household, subtly undermining an adversary's power while appearing entirely lawful and conventional. The children of these unions would inherit claims, lands, and influence that reshaped political alliances. Historians studying Italian city-states often remark on how bloodlines became the most efficient weapon for settling scores that swords and sieges could not resolve. Marriage as revenge also had a psychological element. Offended families could watch, year after year, as their rivals' descendants slowly gained influence, amassed wealth, or inherited disputed claims. It was a persistent reminder that an insult, slight, or betrayal could never truly be ignored. The slow unfolding of consequences was often more humiliating than immediate retaliation. By the time the revenge reached its peak, it had already become a historical inevitability, a quiet punishment embedded in generations of social and political structure. Consider the marriage strategies of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, and his successors arranged marriages with precision. Every union was not just a political alliance, it was a method of asserting dominance, punishing rivals indirectly, and consolidating influence across multiple kingdoms. Enemies who had once mocked or insulted the family suddenly found themselves undermined not on the battlefield, but in council chambers, parliaments, and through claims passed quietly from generation to generation. This slow, deliberate, and patient approach to revenge allowed the Hohenstaufens to maintain influence far beyond what brute force alone could achieve. Even in England, marriage alliances became a tool for revenge and power consolidation during the Wars of the Roses. Every York-Lancaster union, every carefully orchestrated match between distant cousins, was a calculated effort to reclaim lost lands, assert claims, and correct past humiliations. The stakes were enormous. Nobles invested decades in careful observation, calculating which families would provide the best opportunities to avenge past losses without risking outright conflict. Generations later, historians could trace entire wars back to a single marriage arranged decades earlier, proving that the slow hand of strategic revenge could rival, and often surpass, the immediacy of swords. Marriage alliances as revenge were not limited to Europe. Across medieval Asia and the Middle East, rulers used the same principles. A princess from one dynasty married into a rival household, creating claims and obligations that could only be exercised decades later. These unions often produced heirs with legitimate authority over lands or titles that had been denied to their ancestors. Patience, strategy, and meticulous observation replaced swords, and the results often reshaped entire regions over lifetimes. The most remarkable feature of revenge through marriage is that it is enduring, cumulative, and virtually unavoidable. Unlike battles, assassinations, or political coups, it cannot be undone immediately. Once a child is born into a strategic union, the consequences are permanent. The lineages carry both the legacy of offense and the potential for retribution indefinitely. One slight can echo through generations, quietly influencing alliances, wars, and claims. What made this kind of revenge particularly insidious is its subtlety. A family may never realize that a marriage arranged decades prior is slowly undermining their influence or reclaiming lands that were once lost. The instrument of revenge appears innocuous, a wedding, a dowry, a union, but its effects accumulate over time. By the moment the target family recognizes what has happened, the outcome is often irreversible. The past, in the form of deliberate, patient alliances, reaches into the present to assert its power. Even the modern world still carries echoes of this medieval strategy. Consider the persistence of aristocratic influence in Europe and beyond. Many family fortunes, titles, and properties are shaped by centuries-old marriages, each of which may have originally been arranged as political maneuvering or a form of revenge. The descendants inherit not just wealth, but the accumulated consequences of strategies executed long before they were born. Every negotiation, every wedding contract, every inherited estate becomes a living testament to patience, calculation, and the enduring power of revenge executed quietly through marriage. Revenge through marriage is not dramatic. There are no swords drawn, no immediate blood spilled, no single climactic moment. Its brilliance lies in its patience, its invisibility, and the way it shapes generations without anyone ever noticing until the consequences are unavoidable. Unlike battles, which can be won and lost in a day, marriages persist for lifetimes. Unlike political coups, which can be undone or reversed, children born into strategic unions carry forward the legacy of calculated vengeance naturally. Ultimately, the quiet wars of marriage demonstrate a principle that medieval Europe understood profoundly: time is a weapon, bloodlines are instruments, and patience is power. Insults, betrayals, and slights can be addressed not only with swords, but with strategic foresight, careful planning, and deliberate alignment of heirs and alliances. Revenge does not always roar. Sometimes, it whispers through generations, reshaping the political and social landscape without the participants ever realizing the full magnitude of what is happening. In the end, the victims of these alliances often have no one to blame. The unions appear normal, even beneficial, until the consequences are unavoidable. Every child born into the arrangement, every claim asserted decades later, every political shift that reasserts old grievances, all are the results of calculated, patient revenge. And those who orchestrated these unions, queens, kings, noble families, often outlived their enemies, leaving their heirs to quietly finish what they had begun. Revenge through marriage is the medieval art of patience, calculation, and indirect power. It does not dazzle like a battlefield victory, it does not terrify like public executions, and it is rarely chronicled with drama in contemporary accounts. Yet it endures, shaping kingdoms, rewriting history, and proving that the quiet, patient hand can often be the deadliest weapon of all. Revenge through inheritance may be the quietest form of medieval retaliation, but it was also one of the most inevitable. Unlike marriage, which required consent and ceremony, inheritance worked automatically. Time did the work. Death triggered the consequences. And medieval elites understood this better than anyone. When a noble family was insulted, dispossessed, or humiliated, they often did nothing visible at all. They simply ensured their lineage survived longer than their enemies. This sounds passive, but it was not. It required obsessive attention to bloodlines, succession laws, legitimacy, and documentation. A single surviving heir could undo decades of political dominance. Consider the countless medieval disputes over land. Castles, villages, forests, and entire counties were rarely taken cleanly. They were seized, contested, reclaimed, and lost again. Revenge came when a family quietly produced an heir with a stronger legal claim than the one currently ruling. That heir might be a grandson, a niece, or a distant cousin. It didn't matter. What mattered was paperwork, witnesses, and time. When the ruling lord died, suddenly the old insult resurfaced. Charters were produced. Priests testified. Nobles remembered old promises. Courts convened. And just like that, land changed hands without a single sword being raised. The dispossessed family didn't need to fight. They simply waited for death to open the door. This kind of revenge drove medieval rulers mad, because it could not be prevented by force alone. You could kill enemies, burn villages, destroy castles, but if even one legitimate descendant survived, the claim remained alive. It waited patiently, sometimes for generations, until circumstances aligned. This is why medieval politics was obsessed with legitimacy. Bastards were excluded not out of moral outrage, but because illegitimate blood disrupted revenge mechanisms. A bastard could not carry a grievance forward legally. A legitimate child could carry it indefinitely. The most dangerous enemies were not rebels in the field. They were children in exile, quietly growing older. One of the clearest examples comes from Normandy and England after 1066. William the Conqueror seized England by force, but his descendants nearly lost it through inheritance chaos. Rival claimants emerged not because they were stronger, but because they were technically more legitimate under evolving laws. Old grudges resurfaced in courtrooms instead of battlefields. Revenge was pursued with seals, signatures, and genealogies. This led to a medieval obsession with ancestry. Families memorized lineages like weapons inventories. Monasteries preserved genealogies not as academic exercises, but as tools of future power. Every birth was documented. Every marriage was recorded. Every death was noted carefully, because each one moved the board closer to resolution. Revenge through inheritance also shaped medieval patience. A man insulted in his youth might never see justice in his lifetime. That didn't matter. He planned revenge for his children. Or his grandchildren. Or someone not yet born. This generational mindset is difficult for modern audiences to grasp. Medieval people did not expect closure quickly. They expected continuity. If revenge could not be achieved now, it would be achieved later. Time was not a problem. Time was the solution. This mindset explains why medieval feuds lasted centuries. Not because people were irrational, but because they were methodical. Every generation inherited not only land and titles, but grievances. These grievances were treated like heirlooms. Preserved. Remembered. Acted upon when the moment finally arrived. Sometimes revenge succeeded simply because one family endured longer. Disease, war, and accidents eliminated rivals faster than any assassination. The family that stayed alive won by default. Their survival itself became the punishment. In medieval chronicles, you will often find phrases like, "and thus the line ended." This is not neutral language. It is judgment. To lose your line was to lose everything. Your enemies didn't need to destroy you violently. They only needed to outlast you. Revenge through survival was especially potent against ambitious conquerors. Men who rose quickly often fell just as fast. Their families collapsed under pressure, scandal, or succession disputes. Meanwhile, quieter families, less visible, less ambitious, survived in the background. When the conqueror's line failed, those quieter families reclaimed influence without resistance. This was not accidental. It was planned. Many medieval houses deliberately avoided overexpansion. They married conservatively. They avoided unnecessary wars. They focused on producing legitimate heirs and maintaining stability. Their revenge against aggressive rivals was simple: remain standing. When those rivals eventually destroyed themselves, the survivors inherited the ruins. This strategy shaped entire regions. In Italy, Germany, and France, dozens of once powerful houses vanished entirely. Their lands passed not to conquerors, but to patient neighbors with cleaner claims and longer memories. Revenge through inheritance also created a chilling emotional distance. Medieval elites did not need to hate personally. They needed to remember structurally. Anger was not required. Documentation was. This is why medieval revenge often feels cold in retrospect. There is no outburst. No confrontation. Just a moment when a title passes quietly to someone else, and a family realizes too late that they have lost everything. Even monasteries participated in this system. Donations were not always acts of piety. They were insurance. A monastery that remembered your lineage could later support your descendants' claims. Religious memory became political memory. The church itself was one of the most powerful instruments of delayed revenge. Excommunications, annulments, and legitimacy rulings could be stored for decades before being used. A ruling issued at the right moment could invalidate an entire bloodline. This meant revenge did not require visibility. It required endurance. In medieval society, the most terrifying enemy was not the one who threatened you openly. It was the one who said nothing, kept records, and waited. Because eventually, everyone dies. And when they did, medieval revenge did not arrive with anger. It arrived with inheritance. Revenge through law was the most sophisticated form of medieval retaliation, because it disguised vengeance as order. It did not look like anger. It looked like procedure. And that made it nearly unstoppable. Medieval law was not neutral. It was flexible, local, and deeply shaped by custom. Whoever controlled interpretation controlled outcomes. Families that had been wronged learned to stop reacting emotionally and start shaping rules instead. If a rival could not be defeated in battle, they could be defeated by redefining what was legal. This process was slow. Painfully slow. And that was the point. A family humiliated by seizure of land might not try to reclaim it immediately. Instead, they would begin influencing how land was inherited, taxed, or defended. They supported local customs that favored divided inheritance if their enemy relied on a single heir. Or they pushed for primogeniture if they knew their own line was more stable. Every legal adjustment was a quiet strike. Over time, these adjustments hardened into tradition. And tradition was stronger than kings. One of the most dangerous acts in medieval society was writing something down and having people accept it as how things have always been. Once a custom existed long enough, challenging it made you look unreasonable, even rebellious. Revenge became invisible because it felt natural. This is how entire noble houses were weakened without a single act of violence. Laws were adjusted around them until their power simply faded. Consider medieval forest laws. On the surface, these were about hunting and conservation. In reality, they were weapons. A rival lord who relied on forest resources could be fined, restricted, or criminalized. His followers could be punished for survival behaviors that had been legal for generations. Slowly, his economic base collapsed, all under the justification of law. Revenge through law also exploited the medieval fear of disorder. People hated chaos more than injustice. If revenge was framed as maintaining stability, it was welcomed, even when it destroyed lives. This made legal revenge deeply cruel. The victim often had no idea they were being punished. They followed the rules and still lost everything. Guild laws worked the same way. A family excluded from power might influence guild standards to bar rivals' sons from membership. Technicalities were enforced ruthlessly. Apprenticeships denied. Licenses withheld. Economic suffocation followed. Again, no swords. No blood. Just silence. Kings themselves fell victim to this strategy. When monarchs abused their power, revenge rarely came immediately. Instead, laws were created to assist governance. Councils were formed, oversight committees appeared. Consent clauses were introduced. Each reform seemed reasonable. Together, they stripped kings of authority. The Magna Carta was not an explosion of anger. It was an accumulation of revenge. Each clause reflected a remembered insult, a broken promise, a confiscated estate. The barons didn't seek chaos. They sought correction, written permanently. And once written, it could not be unwritten easily. This kind of revenge was generational. A law passed to humble one king would restrict all future kings. The original target might die, but the punishment endured. This is why medieval rulers feared precedent more than rebellion. A rebellion could be crushed. A precedent could not. Families that mastered legal revenge became terrifyingly effective. They trained sons in canon law. They placed relatives in ecclesiastical courts. They funded monasteries that produced educated clerks. Knowledge became weaponized patience. Over decades, these families reshaped entire legal systems to favor themselves. Outsiders didn't realize what was happening until they found every court ruling went against them. Even church law was used this way. Annulments destroyed marriages retroactively. Legitimacy could be revoked. Heirs erased from succession. Revenge became metaphysical. A man could lose everything not because he was defeated, but because he was reclassified, and the most unsettling part was how ordinary it all felt. Judges spoke calmly. Documents were sealed. Life continued. This is the medieval lesson modern people often miss. Revenge did not always look emotional. It looked bureaucratic. And bureaucracy lasts longer than anger. As generations passed, these legal structures became self-sustaining. No one remembered who had been wronged originally. They only remembered the law. Revenge had become system. At that point, it no longer needed intent. The people enforcing it might believe they were being fair. The people benefiting might believe they were simply fortunate. Only historians, centuries later, could trace the pattern back to a single insult that had never been forgiven. This is why medieval revenge feels endless. It was designed that way. Not for satisfaction. For permanence, revenge through religion was the most elegant and dangerous form of medieval retaliation, because it convinced everyone, including the victim, that the punishment was deserved. In a world where salvation, damnation, and eternal memory mattered more than comfort or even life, control over spiritual meaning was absolute power. To be condemned physically was temporary. To be condemned spiritually was permanent. Excommunication was not just a religious penalty. It was social erasure. When someone was excommunicated, they were cut off from sacraments, burial rites, and communal life. People could not legally trade with them, shelter them, or even speak to them without risking their own souls. This turned entire towns into enforcement mechanisms. Revenge did not require guards. Fear handled the rest. And excommunication was often political. A noble who challenged a bishop, defied a pope, or inconvenienced a powerful abbey might find themselves suddenly labeled sinful. The charges were rarely dramatic. Disobedience, pride, disrespect for sacred authority. All flexible categories. Once labeled, escape was nearly impossible. Appeals took years. During that time, enemies consolidated power, seized lands, and rewrote narratives. By the time forgiveness was granted, if it ever was, the damage was complete. This was revenge that didn't bleed. It starved. Religious institutions also controlled burial. Denying a Christian burial was devastating. It meant exclusion from consecrated ground and raised terrifying questions about the soul's fate. Families begged, paid, negotiated. Many complied with humiliating terms just to reclaim the dead. This created a chilling leverage system. Harm the wrong cleric, and generations of your family might suffer spiritual consequences. Public penance was another weapon. Being forced to confess sins publicly, barefoot, in rags, before neighbors, was not about forgiveness. It was about humiliation. Memory. Making sure the offense was never forgotten. The offender lived on, but their dignity did not. Church courts were particularly effective because they didn't require proof in the modern sense. Reputation mattered. Oaths mattered. Witnesses who were morally suspect could be dismissed. This allowed careful manipulation. If you wanted revenge, you didn't accuse your enemy of a crime. You accused them of immorality. Heresy accusations were especially lethal. Once someone was suspected of heretical beliefs, everything they said was suspect. Defending yourself only made you look more guilty. Silence looked like confession. Many accusations began as personal disputes. Land disagreements. Marriage conflicts. Political rivalry. The language of faith transformed these into existential threats. And the church remembered. Religious chronicles recorded events with moral judgment embedded into narrative. A rival lord wasn't just defeated, he was punished by God. A failed campaign became divine retribution. Illness was framed as deserved suffering. This mattered because chronicles shaped future legitimacy. If history recorded you as sinful, your descendants inherited the stain. This is how revenge crossed time. Even rituals could be weaponized. Refusing communion publicly. Turning away at confession. Assigning excessive fasting or pilgrimage as penance. These were socially visible acts. Pilgrimage itself could be punishment. Long, dangerous journeys imposed on enemies under the guise of redemption. Many never returned. Others returned ruined. And if they died, the church had done nothing wrong. Monasteries participated quietly. They accepted donations from one side, legitimizing their claim. They refused prayers for others. Spiritual silence spoke loudly. Religious revenge was rarely about theology. It was about authority. Who had the power to define sin? Who had the power to forgive? Who controlled access to meaning? Those who controlled meaning controlled memory. And memory, in medieval society, was the final battlefield. A man could be forgiven by the church but never fully restored socially. People remembered who had been condemned. Suspicion lingered. This is why medieval revenge didn't always seek death. Death ended suffering. Condemnation prolonged it. To be alive but spiritually suspect was worse. By the late Middle Ages, rulers understood this so well that they feared clerics more than armies. A king could survive invasion. He could not survive being declared illegitimate in the eyes of God. That is why so many medieval conflicts ended not with swords, but with letters from Rome. Revenge did not shout. It absolved itself. Revenge through memory was slower than violence, quieter than law, and far more permanent. Medieval people understood something modern societies often forget. Whoever controls the story controls the outcome, even after everyone involved is dead. Most medieval people would never read a chronicle. That didn't matter. Chronicles were written for those who shaped power, clergy, nobles, future rulers. Being remembered wrongly was not an inconvenience. It was annihilation. Chroniclers were not neutral observers. They were employees. Monks recorded history under patronage. Court sponsored writers. Victors paid for parchment. This meant revenge could be achieved without lifting a weapon. You simply made sure your enemy was written as foolish, sinful, weak, or divinely punished. A lost battle could be reframed as arrogance. A political failure became God's judgment. A rival's illness was described as corruption manifesting in flesh. Even accidents were moralized. Falling from a horse meant divine disapproval. Dying young suggested hidden sin. Once written, these judgments hardened. Future generations would read them as fact. This allowed revenge to reach beyond a single lifetime. A rival lord might die peacefully, but his grandchildren would inherit a legacy of shame. Titles could be questioned. Claims undermined. Alliances weakened by whispers from history. Some families fought for decades just to rehabilitate a name. Others never succeeded. Medieval memory was not passive. It was curated. Songs and stories did similar work among common people. Ballads exaggerated cruelty, cowardice, or betrayal until the real person disappeared beneath the legend. Heroes were simplified. Villains flattened. Nuance died quickly. This kind of revenge was democratic. You didn't need wealth. You needed repetition. Say something often enough, and it became true. Communities remembered insults. Towns remembered massacres. Borders remembered betrayals. Feuds persisted because memory was actively maintained through ritual, storytelling, and grievance inheritance. Children were taught who wronged them. Not why. Just who. Public monuments reinforced memory. Churches commissioned memorials emphasizing virtue and sacrifice. Enemies were excluded. Names were left out deliberately. Silence became accusation, even burial location mattered. Being buried outside honored ground suggested moral failure. Being buried anonymously erased identity. Being buried prominently asserted righteousness. Who lay where mattered. Revenge also lived in legal memory. Court records preserved accusations even if cases were dropped. Rumors became documentation. Future disputes reopened old wounds with official backing. This made forgiveness difficult. You could forgive a man. You could not forgive a document. Medieval rulers exploited this. When rivals were defeated, their crimes were recorded meticulously. Even minor offenses were exaggerated. Mercy in action was paired with condemnation in ink. This preserved the ruler's image as just, while ensuring the enemy's reputation never recovered. The most effective revenge was not killing your enemy. It was making sure they could never be admired. Some people fought back by commissioning their own histories. Competing narratives clashed across monasteries and regions. Truth fractured. This is why medieval history is so contradictory. It isn't confusion. It's warfare. Memory was contested ground. And unlike battlefields, it never stopped shifting. Long after swords rusted and castles crumbled, stories endured. Families rose or fell based on how well their ancestors were remembered. Nations justified wars using centuries-old grievances preserved in narrative form. Revenge became inheritance. By the end of the medieval period, this understanding was widespread. Power was not just military or legal. It was narrative. If you lost control of the story, you lost everything. And so medieval revenge learned patience. It waited for scribes. It waited for songs. It waited for time. Because time, properly guided, finished what violence began. Revenge through bloodlines was the most patient form of medieval retaliation, because it required accepting that you might never see the outcome yourself. Medieval people were surprisingly comfortable with that idea. Legacy mattered more than satisfaction. Marriage was not romance. It was a weapon. Every marriage contract reshaped alliances, transferred land, and rewrote future power. To marry well was to strike an enemy without drawing blood. To marry badly was to doom a family for generations. Families remembered insults the way they remembered property boundaries. If a rival house humiliated you, stole land, or blocked advancement, you did not respond immediately. You waited until marriage negotiations presented an opening that a strategically chosen spouse could isolate a rival, drain their influence, or redirect inheritance away from them permanently. This was revenge without confrontation. Dowries were critical. A large dowry could strengthen one line while weakening another. Withholding one could ruin prospects. Some families deliberately married daughters into rival houses with conditions that ensured assets flowed outward, never returning. Sons-in-law became tools. Grandchildren became leverage. Inheritance laws were flexible, often manipulable. Bastardy accusations could delegitimize heirs. Disputed wills reopened old conflicts. A single successful challenge could erase decades of planning. Families weaponized genealogy. Suddenly, your rival's son was not quite legitimate. Or your cousin's marriage was canonically invalid. Or a distant ancestor's land grant was improperly sanctioned. These arguments weren't about accuracy. They were about opportunity. And they worked because medieval society respected lineage deeply, even when it was contradictory. Church courts handled marriage validity. Secular courts handled land. Each had different rules. Skilled families navigated both, exploiting contradictions to undermine rivals. This meant revenge could be slow, subtle, and devastating. Your enemy might die believing their line secure, only for their grandchildren to lose everything due to a legal challenge rooted in a long-forgotten slight. Women played a central role in this form of revenge. While often denied direct political power, they controlled marriage networks, kinship ties, and inheritance transmission. A well-placed woman could redirect power across regions. This made women both valuable and dangerous in medieval politics. Some families educated daughters carefully, not for obedience, but for influence. They learned negotiation, memory, and restraint. They remembered who wronged them. And they waited. Marriage revenge also extended internationally. Royal marriages created obligations that could be invoked generations later. Claims to thrones emerged from marriages arranged long ago for reasons no one remembered clearly. Wars were fought over wedding contracts centuries old. That was not chaos. That was design. Bloodline revenge was cruel because it punished the innocent. Descendants paid for ancestors' conflicts. Medieval society accepted this without discomfort. Collective identity outweighed individual fairness. You were your family. And your family's enemies were yours. This made reconciliation rare. Peace treaties ended fighting, not memory. Marriage contracts sometimes enforced peace temporarily, but resentment lingered, stored like a debt. Eventually, someone collected. This is why medieval revenge was so enduring. It did not rely on emotion alone. It relied on structure. Law. Church. Family. Memory. Together, they ensured that revenge could outlive its author. And that was considered success. Revenge through law was the most exhausting form of medieval punishment, and that was precisely the point. Medieval justice was not designed for fairness. It was designed for endurance. Whoever could last the longest usually won. Legal systems in the medieval world were slow, expensive, fragmented, and deeply personal. Courts overlapped. Jurisdictions conflicted. Appeals multiplied. This chaos was not a flaw. It was an opportunity. If you wanted revenge, you did not aim to win quickly. You aimed to entangle. A rival could be dragged into court repeatedly over land boundaries, feudal obligations, unpaid dues, or alleged violations of custom. Each case required travel, witnesses, documentation, and time. Each delay drained resources. Even when accusations failed, the damage accumulated. Legal revenge rarely targeted the person directly. It targeted their ability to function. Land seizures pending investigation. Fines imposed provisionally. Titles suspended temporarily. These temporary measures often lasted years. By the time a verdict arrived, if it ever did, the target was already weakened. Feudal law was especially effective. Obligations between lords and vassals were deliberately vague. This allowed interpretation. A missed duty could become disloyalty. A late payment could become defiance. Punishments escalated quietly. Manorial courts targeted common people the same way. Small infractions piled up. Fines repeated. Labor obligations increased. Resistance became evidence of guilt. People didn't revolt immediately. They endured. That endurance was exploited. Church courts added another layer. Marriage disputes, morality charges, oath violations. A single conflict could move between secular and ecclesiastical courts endlessly. Each court claimed authority. Each demanded compliance. The accused paid twice. Paperwork mattered. Charters, seals, witnesses. Losing a document could cost land. Forged documents were common. Proving forgery was nearly impossible. Whoever controlled the archives controlled reality. Legal revenge also relied on precedent. Once a ruling existed, it could be cited endlessly. One successful case became a weapon for generations. Entire regions were reshaped by legal revenge disguised as order. Kings learned this well. They issued laws that targeted specific enemies without naming them. Taxes applied unevenly. Exemptions rewarded loyalty. Disobedience became treason retroactively. Law provided plausible deniability. A ruler could claim innocence while watching a rival collapse under obligations they could never meet. This made law safer than violence. If you killed a rival, you invited retaliation. If you ruined them legally, you looked righteous. The cruelty was slow. Families sold land to pay fines. Marriages were delayed. Children were sent away. Estates fragmented. Influence evaporated. Eventually, resistance stopped not because justice was served, but because exhaustion won. Legal revenge did not end in death. It ended in disappearance. Revenge through economics was subtle enough to look accidental and powerful enough to collapse entire families. Medieval people understood that hunger was more persuasive than violence and far less likely to provoke heroic resistance. Trade in the medieval world was fragile. Markets depended on trust, access, and permission. Remove any one of those, and livelihoods vanished. If you wanted revenge, you didn't burn someone's farm. You made sure no one bought from it. Guilds were especially effective tools. Membership controlled who could sell goods, set prices, or operate legally. Being expelled from a guild was not symbolic. It meant financial death. Expulsion could be justified by minor offenses. Improper weights. Disrespect toward a master. Failure to observe feast days. These accusations were easy to manufacture and hard to disprove. Once expelled, no one dared trade with you. Doing so risked their own standing. Markets also enforced revenge. A merchant accused of dishonesty might find themselves barred from stalls, refused credit, or denied storage. Word traveled fast. Reputation was currency, lords participated eagerly. Toll exemptions were granted selectively. Roads were closed for repairs. River crossings were restricted. Licenses were delayed. All legal. All devastating. Even peasants were not immune. Access to common land could be restricted. Grazing rights revoked. Mills denied. Ovens closed. Survival became expensive. These measures were justified as enforcement of order. They were revenge. Trade embargoes existed long before modern states named them. Cities denied entry to merchants from rival towns. Entire regions starved economically. This forced submission without battle. Debt was another weapon. Loans were extended with cruel terms. Interest accumulated. Default allowed asset seizure. One missed payment could unravel generations of work, and because lending was often religiously regulated, debt carried moral judgment. Failure suggested sin. Economic revenge also traveled through marriage. Dowries were withheld. Contracts broken. Alliances dissolved. Money shaped bloodlines. Most importantly, economic revenge was invisible to chroniclers. Few records describe slow ruin. No battles. No executions. Just names disappearing from ledgers. That invisibility made it safe. People suffered quietly. Pride prevented complaint. Shame enforced silence. By the time outsiders noticed, there was nothing left to defend. This is why medieval revenge was so effective. It targeted systems, not bodies. It made enemies complicit in their own collapse. They sold land. They dismissed servants. They withdrew from public life. Eventually, they vanished. And history called it misfortune. Revenge through spectacle was designed to be unforgettable. Medieval societies believed that punishment was only effective if it was seen, remembered, and retold. Pain faded. Shame lingered. Public humiliation was not an accessory to punishment. It was the punishment. Markets, church steps, town squares, these were theaters of discipline. Everyone attended, whether they wanted to or not. To be punished privately was merciful. To be punished publicly was educational. Stocks, pillories, and public cages were tools of memory. The goal was not injury. It was exposure. You were placed where people bought bread, met friends, and exchanged gossip. Your humiliation became communal entertainment. People threw food, insults, and occasionally worse. Children learned lessons. Adults reinforced hierarchy. The accused absorbed the message that they had fallen. Clothing mattered. Offenders wore symbols of their crime. Adulterers wore specific colors. Fraudsters carried the tools they misused. Perjurers bore visible signs. These symbols followed people long after the punishment ended. Songs were sung about them. Nicknames stuck. Shame was portable. Nobles were not immune. When elites were humiliated publicly, it was devastating. A lord forced to kneel, a knight stripped of spurs, a ruler made to confess publicly, these moments ended careers. Honor mattered more than comfort. Even rumors of humiliation weakened authority. Executions themselves were theatrical. The speech before death mattered. Silence could be read as guilt. Defiance could be interpreted as arrogance. Crowds judged. But revenge did not always involve death. In fact, survival often worsened the punishment. A man who lived after public humiliation carried the memory forever. People remembered the moment. Trust evaporated. Some communities never allowed reintegration. Public shaming also extended to family members. Wives, children, siblings, all absorbed collateral damage. Marriage prospects declined. Trade suffered. This collective punishment reinforced obedience. Authorities exploited this carefully. They staged punishments at peak hours. They invited witnesses. They recorded events. Revenge became pedagogy. And people internalized it. Eventually, the mere threat of public exposure was enough. Confessions came easily. Compliance followed. The most effective humiliation was ritualized. Formal. Predictable, everyone knew what would happen. That certainty frightened more than violence. This is why medieval revenge endured. It used society against the individual. No escape. No anonymity. Only memory. Exile was revenge stretched across time. Medieval societies understood something brutal and precise: death was quick, but displacement was slow, humiliating, and endlessly exhausting. To be cast out was to be erased without mercy, yet forced to keep living. Exile did not come with drama. No cheering crowds. No speeches. Just a declaration that you no longer belonged anywhere that mattered. You were given days, sometimes hours, to leave. Your property might be seized. Your name struck from records. Your protection revoked. Roads became hostile. Villages became suspicious. Every border became a question you could not answer convincingly. In a world without identification, reputation was everything. And exile destroyed it. People asked where you were from. You had to lie or explain. Both were dangerous. Too honest, and doors closed. Too vague, and suspicion followed. Many exiles wandered endlessly, moving just far enough to survive, never far enough to belong. They slept in barns, under church eaves, in forests where wolves understood territory better than humans did. This was not accidental cruelty. It was deliberate. Exile weaponized uncertainty. You did not know where food would come from tomorrow. You did not know who would turn you in. You did not know whether the road ahead led to shelter or a noose. Authorities preferred exile because it avoided martyrdom. No grave. No rallying symbol. Just slow disappearance. But exile also served revenge beautifully. Those cast out watched life continue without them. They heard news late. They saw former friends thrive. They learned that the world had adjusted effortlessly to their absence. That knowledge cut deeper than punishment. Some exiles tried to return secretly. This rarely ended well. If caught, the punishment intensified. Amputation. Branding. Execution. Return without permission was framed as defiance, not desperation. Others tried to reinvent themselves elsewhere. This required suppressing memory, identity, and pride. Many failed. Even successful exiles lived with constant fear of recognition. Accents betrayed origins. Habits exposed backgrounds. A single familiar face could undo years of survival. Exile was particularly devastating for nobles. A noble without land was a contradiction. Power came from place. Remove the place, and the title collapsed into farce. Cases did not begin with evidence. They began with accusations. An accusation from the right person mattered more than truth. Once named, a person entered a system that consumed time, money, and reputation relentlessly. Hearings were postponed. Witnesses were delayed. Documents were misplaced. Months became years. This delay was not incompetence. It was strategy. The longer a case dragged on, the more damage it caused. Defendants sold land to pay fees. Families fractured. Allies drifted away. Even if acquitted, nothing returned. Legal revenge thrived on uncertainty. A person under accusation could not plan. Could not travel. Could not invest. Could not marry advantageously. They lived suspended. Judges were theoretically neutral. In practice, they were connected. Kinship, obligation, and patronage shaped outcomes quietly. A judge did not need to rule against you. He only needed to rule slowly. Clerical courts added another layer. Charges of heresy, moral misconduct, or blasphemy were vague by design. Proof was flexible. Repentance was demanded publicly. Once labeled sinful, a person became vulnerable everywhere. Excommunication was devastating. It cut people off from community, commerce, and salvation simultaneously. No sacraments. No legal standing. No protection, people avoided you like disease. Legal revenge often used overlapping jurisdictions. If one court failed, another was activated. Secular law. Church law. Guild regulations. There was always another avenue. Nobles used law to neutralize rivals without open warfare. Why risk battle when parchment could do the work? A lawsuit could block inheritance. Freeze lands. Disqualify heirs. Generations were affected. Entire families fell because of a single legal maneuver. The brilliance of legal revenge was deniability. No blood on hands. No public outrage. Everything appeared orderly. Even victims internalized blame. They wondered if compliance would save them. It rarely did. Confession was encouraged. Silence was suspicious. Cooperation often extended the ordeal. Legal revenge also relied on literacy. Most people could not read charges against them. They depended on intermediaries who charged fees and offered selective advice. Ignorance was profitable. Public records preserved accusations indefinitely. Even cleared individuals carried stains. Future disputes resurrected old allegations. Memory was institutionalized. Law also allowed revenge to be delayed intentionally. A grievance could be filed decades later. A dormant claim reactivated at the worst possible moment. Weddings. Successions. Military campaigns. Timing mattered more than justice. Revenge through law taught restraint. It rewarded patience. It punished impulsivity. The person who waited longest often won. In this system, innocence was irrelevant. What mattered was endurance. Those who survived legal revenge learned caution. Those who did not disappeared quietly. And the system continued unchanged. Because medieval societies did not fear unjust law. They feared disorder more, and law, weaponized carefully, preserved order while destroying enemies efficiently, politely, and permanently. Revenge through marriage, bloodlines, and inheritance was subtle, patient, and devastating. Medieval people understood something powerful: you don't always need to kill an enemy. Sometimes, controlling their family, wealth, or future generations was far more effective. Marriages were tools, not celebrations. They connected families, secured lands, and created alliances, but they could also be carefully weaponized. A poorly timed wedding could erase a rival's influence. A forbidden union could provoke ruin. Children became pawns in strategies spanning decades. Dowries were not just gifts. They were leverage. A noble who withheld a dowry could bankrupt another family. Conversely, marrying off a daughter strategically could shift the balance of power entirely. One alliance meant access to armies, markets, or land. Miss one chance, and an enemy's legacy was permanently weakened. Inheritance was another battlefield. Medieval law favored male heirs, but disputes were common. Challenging legitimacy could disinherit an entire line. False claims, forged documents, and strategic guardianships all became instruments of revenge. Even legitimate heirs were vulnerable. A widow could manipulate succession, naming children in ways that undermined rivals. Step-parents, cousins, and distant relatives could challenge claims years later. By the time a dispute was resolved, the original grievance had matured into total control over someone's legacy. Bloodlines themselves carried memory. Insults, betrayals, and grudges were inherited socially, and marriages allowed revenge to extend beyond a single lifetime. Enemies were humiliated not through immediate loss, but by watching descendants suffer setbacks, alliances shift, and lands dissolve, all legally, subtly, and in plain sight. Sometimes revenge was generational. Families who had wronged a powerful house were not attacked directly. Instead, their children were married poorly, alliances denied, estates slowly fragmented. By the time descendants noticed, the damage was irreversible. And yet, all appeared to follow the rules. Revenge through bloodlines could also manipulate religion. Papal dispensations, forbidden marriages, or delayed confirmations could block inheritance. Families reliant on church approval were trapped in webs of waiting, petitions, and moral obligation. Every delay was a victory for those seeking revenge. This method required patience, planning, and observation. Unlike warfare or murder, there were no immediate fireworks. But over decades, the consequences were devastating. One misaligned marriage could destroy a rival's military strength. One denied dowry could starve their household of influence. One forged testament could rewrite generations. Even when laws and traditions seemed to protect families, the clever planner found loopholes. Guardianships, regencies, adoptions, and fosterings became tools of subtle dominance. Revenge was embedded in the fabric of society itself. And yet, this type of revenge was often invisible to chroniclers. Wars, executions, and uprisings were celebrated. Generational manipulation appeared as luck, chance, or divine favor. The cunning hand that orchestrated slow collapse remained unrecorded, leaving history to misattribute outcomes to coincidence or fate. The lesson is clear: medieval revenge did not always roar. It whispered through alliances, marriages, and inheritances, shaping the future quietly, methodically, and irreversibly. Those who mastered it could destroy rivals without a single sword raised, a single drop of blood spilled, or a single enemy aware of the forces dismantling their legacy. Revenge through assassination and selective elimination was surgical, deliberate, and often terrifyingly effective. Medieval societies understood that power was fragile, and removing the right person at the right time could reshape kingdoms, alliances, and futures. Unlike battlefield victories, assassination did not rely on armies or sieges. It relied on intelligence, patience, and precision. Targets were studied for months, even years. Daily routines, habits, personal guards, and trusted confidants were mapped meticulously. Knowledge became a weapon. Poison was one of the most common tools. It was subtle, silent, and difficult to trace. A meal, a drink, a letter laced with toxins, each could end a life without the public spectacle of war. Poison required patience and cunning. Timing was everything. Too soon, and the target survived. Too late, and the opportunity disappeared. Blades and ambushes were used when subtlety failed. However, even here, planning mattered. Targets were chosen for vulnerability, isolated, distracted, or overconfident. Execution needed precision. Mistakes could backfire, turning assassins into martyrs or creating chaos that endangered the planner. Assassination was as much psychological as physical. Rumors were spread in advance to unsettle targets. Threats were hinted at, loyalties tested. Fear became part of the method. Often, the enemy weakened themselves long before the actual act. High-profile killings had consequences far beyond the immediate. Nobles feared betrayal. Kings reconsidered alliances. Rivals hesitated. Assassination sent a message: power was conditional, fragile, and punishable. The surviving world became hyper-aware of its vulnerabilities. Yet, revenge through assassination also demanded patience. Medieval planners understood that timing could magnify results. Kill too early, and consequences are minor. Kill too late, and enemies may already be entrenched or supported. Optimal timing often meant waiting decades, observing changes in power, loyalty, and opportunity. Targets were not always individuals. Sometimes, assassination aimed to remove advisors, generals, or heirs. This created long-term instability. Entire strategies collapsed because the right person no longer existed to enforce them. Revenge, in this sense, was systemic. Medieval politics rewarded subtlety. Public executions were risky. A visible attempt could inspire retaliation, rebellion, or sympathy. Secret removals minimized collateral damage while maximizing fear. Those who vanished quietly became warnings that were whispered about rather than shouted. Historical examples abound. Political rivals of the Holy Roman Empire were poisoned, ambushed, or mysteriously disappeared. Italian city-states perfected assassination as a tool of control, using mercenaries, loyalists, and spies. Royal courts employed entire networks of informants to ensure the act succeeded without exposing the planner. Assassination also intertwined with law, marriage, and inheritance. Removing a target could enable control over lands, influence, or heirs. Revenge was layered. One act of elimination could cascade through families and territories for decades. The most effective assassins were invisible. They did not rely on reputation or glory. They relied on precision, timing, and planning. Their revenge endured because it was quiet, almost unnoticed, yet permanent. Medieval assassination was a reminder: revenge did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered, waited, and struck when the world believed the moment had passed. Revenge through rebellion and uprising was the loudest, most chaotic, and often the most enduring form of medieval vengeance. Unlike assassination or legal manipulation, this type of revenge relied on collective anger, shared suffering, and meticulous coordination. Rebellions did not start spontaneously. They simmered for years. Taxes too high. Rulers unjust. Food scarce. Laws ignored. Peasants, townspeople, or disenfranchised nobles accumulated grievances quietly, observing the rhythms of authority, waiting for the right moment to act. Leadership was key. Every uprising needed a figure who could unify disparate groups, articulate shared frustrations, and enforce discipline. That leader could be a charismatic noble, a preacher, or even a commoner whose personal grievance symbolized the collective pain. Planning involved logistics that rivaled small armies. Supplies, weapons, intelligence, escape routes, and signals were coordinated secretly. Townspeople shared information through market gossip, coded messages, and church networks. The element of surprise was crucial. Medieval authorities relied on slow communication, giving rebels a window to strike decisively. Uprisings often began quietly. A single act of defiance, refusing a tax, resisting a corvée, attacking a local official, signaled the start. Observation mattered. Rebels studied the enemy's response. They withdrew when the risk was too high and surged when conditions were favorable. Timing, patience, and persistence defined success. Violence was selective, symbolic, and sometimes indiscriminate. Targets were often representatives of oppression: tax collectors, corrupt officials, garrisons, or landlords. Destroying property sent a message to the elite, while sparing innocents maintained popular support. Chaos itself became a weapon. Fear spread faster than armies. Some rebellions relied on coordination across multiple regions. News traveled slowly, so messengers, signals, and local leaders synchronized attacks over weeks or months. Medieval society, fragmented by geography and politics, was uniquely vulnerable to these decentralized networks. Rebellion was also revenge for memory. Communities remembered past injustices, forced conscriptions, executions, land grabs, famine, and betrayal. Each uprising was a culmination of decades of resentment, passed through generations, and carefully timed to exploit weakness in authority. The consequences for rulers were devastating. Even when suppressed, rebellions weakened legitimacy. Nobles and officials who witnessed successful uprisings reconsidered loyalty. Rebellion forced rulers to compromise, redistribute power, or implement reforms they had resisted for decades. Some rebellions succeeded spectacularly. Others failed. Yet even failure sent a message. The memory of defiance lingered. Chronicles recorded grievances. Songs and ballads immortalized resistance. Generations inherited the narrative of rebellion as both cautionary tale and inspiration. Rebellion as revenge was unpredictable. It was loud, immediate, and often messy. Unlike assassination or legal manipulation, it did not require secrecy. It relied on shared outrage, endurance, and courage. It reshaped societies, redistributed power, and forced even the most confident rulers to rethink their assumptions. Even centuries later, historians note that the most effective rebellions were not just about survival or victory, they were about demonstrating that oppression had limits. That collective memory could turn into collective action. That revenge was not always personal, it could be communal, systemic, and lasting. Revenge through propaganda, rumor, and historical record was perhaps the most enduring form of medieval vengeance. Unlike swords, poison, or rebellion, this method required no immediate violence. Its power lay in shaping how people remembered events, ensuring that the target's reputation suffered long after any physical threat had passed. In medieval society, memory was authority. Chroniclers, scribes, and poets were the gatekeepers of legacy. Control of these narratives meant control over how history judged rulers, nobles, and rivals. One clever insult recorded in a manuscript could haunt a family for centuries. Rumors were the first weapon. A whispered accusation of betrayal, cowardice, or moral corruption could spread faster than an army. Markets, taverns, churches, and courts became theaters of perception. By the time the accused discovered the rumor, it often had momentum beyond their control. Written records formalized the damage. Chronicles, annals, and letters allowed grudge holders to embed judgment into the historical archive. Monks who recorded events did not always aim for neutrality. Patronage, politics, and personal belief colored every sentence. A king who slighted a monastery might appear weak in the next generation's account, regardless of his actual deeds. Propaganda was carefully timed and targeted. Ballads commemorated victories, or failures, in ways designed to inflame, entertain, or shame. Artists painted scenes highlighting humiliation, martyrdom, or betrayal. Even architecture could be used. Statues, tombs, and public inscriptions reinforced narratives of power, obedience, or disgrace. Reputation was more than vanity. In medieval society, honor determined alliances, marriages, and legitimacy. A tainted reputation could block inheritances, prevent political marriages, or justify rebellion. Revenge through narrative was permanent because it attacked social currency. Sometimes, revenge through memory was indirect. A noble might fund a religious institution that commemorated their own virtue while subtly denigrating rivals. Annual festivals, prayers, and dedications could quietly reinforce a message of supremacy or moral superiority. The cleverest acts of revenge combined fact with exaggeration. Minor failures became legendary disasters. Timid decisions were reframed as cowardice. Acts of generosity by an enemy were omitted entirely. Over decades, perception became reality. This form of revenge was patient. It required decades, sometimes generations, to fully take effect. Children inherited the consequences of their ancestors' actions, living under reputations crafted long before they were born. Even if someone survived political battles, assassination attempts, or rebellions, they could still be undone by the stories told about them. Propaganda and historical revenge were subtle yet relentless. They turned time itself into an ally. While swords rusted and walls crumbled, words endured. Every chronicler, bard, and scribe became a potential instrument of vengeance. Ultimately, revenge through memory was often more terrifying than physical retaliation. The punished may survive, but their story, their honor, and their legacy could be dismantled quietly, leaving them powerless in the eyes of future generations. In medieval society, this was often the most effective punishment of all. revenge through exile, banishment, and social ostracism was a form of punishment uniquely medieval, subtle, patient, and psychologically devastating. Unlike public execution or battlefield defeat, it removed the target from the world they knew, forcing them into isolation, vulnerability, and dependence, while simultaneously signaling power to those left behind. Exile was not merely physical removal, it was social erasure. Nobles stripped of titles, merchants barred from trade, and commoners forced from towns all experienced the same consequence: invisibility in the networks that sustained medieval life. Without access to markets, courts, alliances, and family networks, survival became precarious. Timing and planning were critical. Exiling someone too early could allow them to find refuge or allies. Waiting too long risked the target consolidating influence. Successful banishment required knowledge of the person's support systems, vulnerabilities, and resources, ensuring that when they left, they truly had nothing left to leverage. Exile could be literal or symbolic. A noble might be sent to a distant castle, ostensibly honored, but in reality, isolated and cut off from political power. Merchants could be forbidden from marketplaces or guilds, forcing them to wander from town to town. Social ostracism worked similarly. A person could remain physically present but be excluded from networks of influence, conversation, and marriage, effectively rendering them invisible. The psychological impact of exile was immense. Medieval communities were tightly structured, status and belonging dictated survival. Being cut off from one's peers, allies, and family created not only fear but also desperation. It forced reliance on strangers or enemies, eroded confidence, and made it easier to manipulate or destroy the exiled over time. Exile was also a tool of revenge for rulers. By removing challengers without bloodshed, leaders avoided martyrdom for the punished while demonstrating power to others. A noble who saw a rival exiled learned a lesson: disobedience, betrayal, or challenge could result in social and political death even if physical death was avoided. Some exiles lasted decades, with the target wandering foreign lands, forging new alliances, or attempting to return. Every failed attempt to reclaim power reinforced the original punisher's authority. Every success became an exception that demanded attention, often inspiring caution in those observing. Religious excommunication often accompanied exile. Being cut off from the church added moral and spiritual consequences to social and political punishment. One was not only isolated from society but also branded as spiritually corrupt, making reintegration even harder. Exile could be temporary or permanent, but even temporary removal inflicted long-term consequences. Wealth could be lost. Estates could be seized. Children could be denied inheritances. Former allies could shift loyalty. Reputation became fragile and easily tarnished. In some cases, exile was strategic rather than purely punitive. Rulers used it to neutralize threats without creating martyrs. By sending an opponent far away, the ruler ensured they were powerless but alive, a constant reminder to others of what could happen if authority was challenged. Ultimately, exile as revenge exploited human dependence on community, visibility, and networks. It demonstrated that power in medieval society was not only about force but also about presence, perception, and social connection. Removing someone quietly could be as effective, if not more so, than any sword, poison, or battle. Revenge through inheritance manipulation and dynastic strategy was one of the most insidious forms of medieval vengeance. It wasn't immediate. It didn't rely on swords, prisons, or public humiliation. Instead, it worked across decades, shaping families, fortunes, and kingdoms long after the original offense. Medieval society revolved around bloodlines. Land, titles, and authority passed through family connections. To control inheritance was to control the future. Rival families or disobedient heirs could be punished not by death, but by removing them from succession, redistributing their wealth, or arranging marriages that undermined their power. Marriage was the ultimate weapon. Alliances were crafted with meticulous care. A daughter might be wed to a distant foreign noble, ensuring the family's influence was diluted. A son might be married off to a family at odds with his own, forcing loyalty conflicts. Every marriage, every dowry, every betrothal could be a form of calculated revenge. Inheritance manipulation also targeted wealth. Estates were divided in ways designed to sow conflict. Siblings were pitted against one another through unequal shares or contested titles. A well-timed will could render a former ally powerless while favoring enemies who were obedient or strategically aligned. Some rulers used succession laws creatively to punish rivals. If an opponent had multiple heirs, laws could be applied to disinherit the eldest, favoring younger siblings who were more malleable. If an adversary had no male heirs, female succession could be enforced in ways that weakened territorial control or led to political marriages unfavorable to the original family. Dynastic revenge was generational. Even after the instigator died, their strategies continued to unfold. A rival's children might grow up excluded, financially dependent, or politically impotent. Every decision regarding heirs and inheritance was a subtle act of vengeance, slowly reshaping the balance of power across decades. Sometimes, manipulation extended to adoption or fosterage. Children were placed in households loyal to the punisher, educated with loyalty, and taught to inherit wealth and authority in ways that undermined their biological families. This long game ensured revenge persisted beyond immediate lifetimes. Legal tools reinforced these strategies. Medieval courts and contracts allowed intricate control over property and succession. Wills, entailments, and land grants were drafted to enforce the punisher's intentions. Disobedience could result in disinheritance, fines, or transfer of estates to loyal allies. This form of revenge was not violent, but it could be devastating. Entire families could lose their standing, influence, and legacy without a single sword being drawn. Power shifted quietly but irreversibly, often leaving rivals alive but impotent. Dynastic revenge also relied on perception. A family publicly disgraced by disinheritance would lose allies, trust, and influence. Even distant nobles recognized the consequences of defiance, reinforcing the punisher's authority without open warfare. In some cases, dynastic strategies led to wars anyway, when disinherited heirs rebelled or foreign powers intervened. Yet the underlying principle remained: revenge through inheritance was precise, patient, and enduring. It outlived temporary victories, battles, and rulers themselves. Ultimately, revenge through inheritance demonstrates the medieval understanding that power is not only physical, it is structural, social, and generational. By shaping who inherited what and when, medieval actors could exact vengeance that resonated across decades, leaving families weakened, rivals constrained, and authority reinforced for generations. Church courts added another layer. Clerical oversight could enforce moral and financial obligations, excommunicate offenders, or place interdicts on entire communities. Threats of spiritual punishment reinforced secular consequences, making compliance unavoidable. A rival could be legally and socially isolated simultaneously. Contracts and charters offered long-term leverage. A single clause could allow a lord to seize land if a minor infraction occurred, or grant oversight of a trade monopoly to an ally. Punishment became baked into agreements, leaving victims powerless even when they followed the letter of the law. Strategic enforcement mattered. Legal punishment could be symbolic or practical. A rival forced to pay small fines or complete tedious obligations repeatedly learned that the punisher controlled not just resources, but time and effort. Even minor victories by the victim felt pyrrhic because the legal system was never neutral. Revenge via law often outlasted its instigator. Successors inherited ongoing obligations, fines, or restrictions, ensuring that the punished family remained constrained for generations. The memory of defeat persisted as rules and records endured. This approach also reinforced social hierarchy. By enforcing compliance through law, the powerful demonstrated authority to everyone else, signaling that disobedience, insult, or rebellion would be managed systematically. Even if subtly, legal revenge could also be combined with other strategies: exile, public humiliation, or inheritance manipulation. For example, a rival might be fined heavily, exiled for non-compliance, and disinherited simultaneously, creating multiple layers of punishment that were legally justified. Ultimately, revenge through law was subtle, patient, and durable. It required intelligence, timing, and control of bureaucratic and social networks. Unlike a sword, it could not be parried. Unlike public shaming, it persisted quietly, gnawing at wealth, freedom, and influence over months or decades. In medieval society, law became a weapon, and patience the most important ally in revenge. Revenge through sabotage and economic disruption was a favorite strategy in medieval Europe, especially when outright warfare was too risky, costly, or politically inconvenient. Unlike battles or duels, economic revenge targeted livelihoods, resources, and infrastructure, undermining power quietly but effectively. Crops and livestock were prime targets. A rival's fields could be burned, irrigated incorrectly, or seeds stolen. Herds might be driven off, poisoned, or scattered. The loss was not just material, it threatened survival. Famine, starvation, or economic instability could follow. This type of revenge was slow-acting, cruel, and difficult to defend against, and it forced the target to expend precious resources in recovery rather than retaliation. Trade disruption was another method. Merchants, artisans, and towns depended on networks of goods and markets. Blocking access to roads, ports, or fairs could ruin an enterprise, while seizing shipments or imposing tolls added layers of financial strain. Rival merchants who depended on trade often found themselves bankrupt before a sword was drawn. Infrastructure was vulnerable. Mills, bridges, and water channels were vital for communities. Destroying or sabotaging them could starve towns of food, water, or industrial capability. For example, redirecting water away from a rival's mill not only reduced income but also undermined social and political influence. Sabotage could be framed as accident or neglect, keeping the punisher's hand hidden while damage accrued. Guilds and professional organizations were arenas for economic revenge. By influencing guild leadership, one could block apprenticeships, certifications, or access to essential tools. This slowed competitors, limited skill development, and ensured long-term dependency. Reputation within the guild also carried social weight, so exclusion was a subtle but punishing blow. Currency and taxation were weapons too. Manipulating coinage, imposing fines, or enforcing taxes selectively weakened rivals. A lord or ruler could reduce the wealth of a rival's territory by raising taxes strategically, allowing their own allies to prosper while enemies struggled. The target often felt trapped: obey the law and lose wealth, resist and risk punishment. Siege tactics frequently incorporated economic sabotage. Starving a castle or town into submission was more efficient than storming it. Destroying crops outside walls, contaminating water, or intercepting supply lines forced the inhabitants to surrender without combat. The psychological effect, watching one's resources dwindle while unable to respond, was a deliberate form of revenge. Poisoning wells or livestock was considered a last resort method, highly risky, and morally charged. But even rumors of such sabotage could intimidate neighbors, allies, and rivals, demonstrating that revenge was not only possible but also cunning. Fear of economic destruction was as persuasive as fear of death. Economic revenge often extended beyond immediate targets. By destabilizing markets, one could influence surrounding regions, causing ripple effects that punished indirect enemies or competitors who relied on the same networks. A single act of sabotage could have cascading consequences, magnifying its impact. Patience and timing were essential. The most effective economic sabotage struck when the target was already vulnerable, after a poor harvest, during political unrest, or following previous losses. A well-timed disruption could convert temporary hardship into long-term decline. Ultimately, revenge through economic disruption was strategic, slow, and psychological. It taught medieval actors that power was not only about armies, swords, or titles, but also about control over resources, trade, and survival. By striking at wealth and infrastructure, a punisher could undermine rivals permanently, quietly, and efficiently. Revenge through propaganda, rumor, and reputation attacks was one of the most insidious forms of medieval vengeance. Unlike swords or sieges, it didn't leave scars, burned villages, or spilled blood, but it could destroy a person's power, influence, and legacy faster than armies ever could. In medieval society, reputation was currency. Nobles, merchants, clerics, and even towns relied on social perception to maintain alliances, trust, and authority. A damaged reputation could mean lost marriages, denied contracts, diminished loyalty from vassals, or social isolation. Revenge through words leveraged this fragility. Rival nobles often spread rumors, sometimes subtle, sometimes outrageous, about moral failings, cowardice, illegitimacy, or betrayal. Once whispered in the right circles, these claims could spread like wildfire. Chroniclers, poets, and clerics could be enlisted to record facts in manuscripts, giving rumors the appearance of legitimacy that lasted for centuries. Satire and public mockery were powerful weapons. Court jesters, minstrels, and performers were sometimes co-opted to ridicule targets through songs, plays, or public performances. Even if exaggerated, the message undermined authority, making the person a figure of amusement rather than respect. Laughter became a tool of revenge, church influence magnified the impact. Clerics could preach against a rival's behavior, question their piety, or suggest moral corruption. Excommunication, threatened or real, ruined reputations and limited influence, both locally and across kingdoms. Religious endorsement or condemnation carried weight that swords could not match. Written records, letters, charters, chronicles, could be subtly altered or misrepresented. A minor offense could be exaggerated into treachery, loyalty could be questioned long after the event. Future generations, reading these accounts, might inherit the judgment without context, making revenge last for centuries. Even gestures and appearances were weaponized. Public insults, seating arrangements, ceremonial precedents, and exclusion from events communicated that someone was unworthy or powerless. The target might comply outwardly while losing authority in subtle but meaningful ways. Every act reinforced the idea, you are not in control. Rumors could destroy economic and political alliances. A claim of betrayal, incompetence, or moral failure might cause allies to withdraw support, merchants to avoid trade, and servants to hesitate in loyalty. The revenge worked indirectly, often without confrontation, leaving the target isolated. Propaganda also manipulated memory. Celebrated achievements could be minimized, failures exaggerated, and histories rewritten. A ruler who humiliated an enemy could ensure that chroniclers emphasized those humiliations for decades. Children and descendants of rivals inherited the social consequences, living with stigma they did not earn. Strategic ambiguity helped. Often, the punisher didn't need to prove anything. The mere suggestion of misconduct was enough to seed distrust. Medieval society loved scandal. The appearance of impropriety often carried more weight than evidence. Reputation could be destroyed by insinuation alone. The ultimate advantage of propaganda as revenge was longevity. A sword can kill a man, but a story can shape centuries. Dynasties could be undermined, political movements destabilized, and social hierarchies shifted, all through words, rumor, and perception. In sum, revenge through reputation attacks shows that in medieval society, the most dangerous weapon was not always physical, it was psychological, social, and cultural. Those who mastered the art could ruin rivals without raising armies or shedding blood, leaving a mark that often outlived both victim and perpetrator. Revenge through symbolic destruction and ritualized punishment was as much about theater as it was about retribution. Medieval actors understood that visibility and symbolism amplified fear, reinforced authority, and cemented messages for generations. In many cases, the act of punishment mattered more than the immediate suffering. Castles, gates, and banners became instruments of revenge. When a lord defeated a rival, he might tear down a fortress, burn a town gate, or desecrate a family emblem. The destruction sent a message not just to the defeated, but to neighbors, allies, and enemies watching closely: challenge me, and this is what awaits you. These acts were carefully choreographed to leave no ambiguity. Bodies themselves were often used symbolically. Execution and mutilation served as visual warnings. Heads on pikes, dismembered corpses, and public hangings communicated a level of consequence impossible to ignore. The punishment extended beyond the individual, it terrorized families, communities, and rival factions. In medieval terms, the act was education in fear. Ritualized punishments also reinforced hierarchy and law. For example, traitors might be executed in the presence of officials, while carefully following ceremonial scripts. The goal was dual: eliminate the target and demonstrate power to the audience. Every gesture, tool, and pronouncement amplified the lesson. Even the choice of location was symbolic: city squares, castle walls, or marketplaces ensured maximum visibility. Revenge was not just about anger, it was about precision, spectacle, and long-term deterrence. The visible act communicated messages that words alone could never achieve. Ultimately, symbolic and ritualized revenge demonstrates that medieval actors understood human psychology. They knew that fear, shame, and awe could be more effective than brute force. By making punishment public, dramatic, and memorable, they ensured their enemies, actual and potential, remembered the consequences of crossing them. Revenge through assassination and targeted elimination was the most direct, and often the most feared, form of medieval vengeance. Unlike public spectacle or symbolic destruction, assassination relied on precision, timing, and often secrecy. Its purpose was not always to inspire terror broadly, but to remove a specific obstacle efficiently and decisively. Political rivals were prime targets. A king, noble, or official who had betrayed, humiliated, or undermined another could be eliminated to restore honor, protect interests, or seize power. Medieval politics was ruthless, positions of authority were finite, and enemies were persistent. Removing a key opponent could reshape alliances, destabilize rival factions, and solidify control. Assassinations were rarely random. Careful observation, planning, and intelligence gathering were essential. Assassins studied routines, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities. Even minor details, what door a noble used, which banquet they attended, or which route they rode, could determine the difference between success and failure. Patience was as important as skill, the methods varied widely. Poison was favored for subtlety: a sip of wine, a tainted meal, or a contaminated ointment could accomplish revenge without visible confrontation. The elegance of poison lay in its deniability. Suspicion might arise, but proof rarely did, allowing the punisher to maintain social or political cover while achieving retribution. Bladed or projectile attacks were used when direct action was necessary or symbolic. A single strike in a hallway, ambush along a road, or sudden confrontation during travel could eliminate rivals efficiently. The public or private nature of the act was carefully considered. Sometimes secrecy maximized fear, sometimes visibility reinforced power. Assassinations often had strategic timing. Removing a rival at the wrong moment could destabilize one's own faction or invite retaliation. Wise medieval actors waited for the right political context, during ceremonies, after alliances shifted, or when public attention was elsewhere. Revenge was most effective when it appeared both sudden and inevitable. Clandestine networks and hired assassins were common. Skilled operatives, mercenaries, spies, or loyal servants, could act in ways the principal could not safely perform. By outsourcing danger, revenge could be executed with minimal personal risk while maintaining maximum impact. Contracts, bribes, and loyalty played a vital role in ensuring success. Beyond politics, assassination also served personal revenge. Family vendettas, feuds, and honor disputes often ended with a carefully orchestrated murder. Bloodlines were defended, insults avenged, and promises of deterrence delivered, all with a single, decisive act. Reputation, memory, and fear were as much targets as the individual's life. Failures were catastrophic. Attempted assassinations could provoke wars, ignite feuds, or invite retaliation. Every act of lethal revenge carried immense risk. Timing, intelligence, and execution were the difference between ultimate victory and devastating escalation. Medieval revenge often required mastery of human behavior as much as mastery of weapons or poison. Assassination also intertwined with legal and religious systems. Some killers were excommunicated, hunted, or punished, while others leveraged clerical protection, diplomatic immunity, or secret alliances. Revenge had to navigate morality, legality, and social norms, all while achieving its deadly goal. The psychological effect of assassination extended beyond the victim. Removing a leader or rival spread fear, uncertainty, and caution among surviving adversaries. Strategic assassination created a chilling precedent, challenged the powerful, and death might arrive quietly, suddenly, and without warning. Ultimately, assassination in medieval revenge combined precision, patience, and strategic understanding. It was both a tool of power and a message of deterrence. Unlike public spectacles or symbolic acts, it often worked in silence, but its echoes were loud, influencing politics, alliances, and fears long after the deed itself. Revenge through exile, imprisonment, and social exclusion was a quieter, slower, but often far more enduring form of medieval vengeance. Unlike assassination or public spectacle, it relied on stripping a person of status, access, and community, turning time, distance, and isolation into weapons. Exile was both punishment and control. Nobles, clergy, or even kings could be forced from their lands, castles, or courts. Their property might be confiscated, allies alienated, and resources limited. Being sent away was not just physical removal, it was a statement: you no longer belong in the sphere of power or influence. The target's presence, which once commanded attention, became irrelevant. Imprisonment, whether in dungeons, towers, or secluded estates, served multiple purposes. It physically restrained the victim while reinforcing social lessons for observers. A prisoner's misery or humiliation was often on display, sending a warning to others who might defy authority. Food, comfort, and communication were controlled. The slow passage of days amplified frustration, despair, and impotence. Social exclusion was even subtler but equally effective. Medieval society functioned on networks of alliances, favors, and obligations. Being excluded from councils, banquets, religious events, or market privileges eroded influence gradually. A noble might find their petitions ignored, their marriages delayed, and their children marginalized. Over years, this quiet revenge could destroy power without a single act of violence. Revenge through displacement required patience. Time was as much a weapon as walls or chains. The longer someone remained away from power or society, the more their networks decayed. Allies sought alternatives, supporters shifted loyalty, and the victim's authority weakened. The very act of absence reshaped the political landscape. Exile often forced reflection, and desperation. Many victims attempted to negotiate, bribe, or scheme their way back. Those who succeeded usually did so with strategic alliances or through decades of patient observation. Those who failed were forgotten or diminished, a testament to the Punisher's ability to turn time into a weapon. Prisons and dungeons were designed to reinforce helplessness. Isolation, sensory deprivation, or minimal interaction drained the victim's capacity for resistance. Letters could be censored, visitors monitored, and privileges granted only strategically. Medieval revenge through imprisonment was about control as much as punishment, a reminder that disobedience had consequences extending far beyond immediate suffering. Social exile often carried symbolic weight. Removing a rival from court, forbidding them entry into city walls, or barring participation in ceremonial life communicated loss of legitimacy. The target's identity was rewritten, formerly powerful, now irrelevant. This form of revenge was sometimes more humiliating than death because it attacked pride, honor, and social recognition. Long-term exile reshaped inheritance, marriage prospects, and territorial claims. A noble removed from their lands might see heirs marry elsewhere, estates absorbed by rivals, and influence eroded. Revenge achieved subtly but persistently could extend beyond a lifetime, affecting generations. Strategic exile was sometimes combined with legal mechanisms. Edicts, decrees, or church sanctions legitimized punishment in the eyes of observers. The punisher's hand remained hidden while authority appeared absolute. Outsiders could enforce the exile, lending it credibility while reinforcing obedience. In medieval terms, exile and imprisonment were not failures, they were slow-acting instruments of revenge, turning powerlessness into punishment and invisibility into deterrence. Those who mastered this form of vengeance reshaped society without a single blade or flame. Revenge through economic sabotage and resource denial was a profoundly effective and often understated method in medieval society. Unlike violent revenge or public spectacle, this approach relied on long-term strategy, careful observation, and an understanding of dependencies, both personal and political. Money, land, trade, and provisions became weapons in their own right. Lords and kings knew that wealth and access to resources were the backbone of power. To undermine an enemy, one could confiscate lands, destroy crops, or disrupt trade routes. A sudden seizure of property could cripple a rival's finances, forcing them into dependency or submission. Without money, armies shrank, alliances faltered, and influence evaporated. Trade embargoes were a particularly insidious form of revenge. Medieval economies relied heavily on the flow of goods, grain, timber, iron, salt, textiles, and luxury items. By blocking merchants, closing ports, or forbidding markets, a ruler could slowly starve rivals of income, prestige, and the materials necessary to maintain their households or armies. The impact was gradual, subtle, and psychologically taxing, often forcing adversaries into negotiation or submission. Resource denial could take many forms. Cutting off water supplies, controlling forests and hunting grounds, or restricting access to mills and ovens made daily life difficult. Peasants, allies, and vassals suffered alongside the primary target, increasing pressure from within. The ripple effect of deprivation could be as punishing as any battlefield defeat. Taxes and fines were also tools of revenge. Medieval rulers often manipulated levies to punish enemies selectively. By raising burdens on specific individuals or regions, a lord could weaken a rival financially while maintaining legal or moral justification. Economic pressure became a silent, constant reminder of vulnerability and dependence. Control of currency and loans added another layer. Lending money with impossible terms or calling in debts at strategic moments could destabilize enemies without physical confrontation. Economic revenge relied on patience and calculation, the effects compounded over time, often unnoticed until the target was dangerously weakened. Sieges combined military and economic revenge. Cutting off a town or castle from supplies, water, and trade forced surrender without direct confrontation. Starvation, disease, and psychological stress became tools of punishment, reinforcing the notion that wealth and sustenance were extensions of power. The siege itself became a long-term exercise in control and humiliation. Even small-scale economic actions could sting. Blocking access to markets, confiscating livestock, or controlling bridges and tolls allowed a clever punisher to dominate a rival without firing a single arrow. The threat alone often forced compliance or submission. Merchants and guilds were not immune. Disfavor with rulers could result in revoked charters, restricted trade rights, or banned participation in fairs. Economic revenge extended beyond nobility, it shaped communities, urban centers, and industries for generations. The medieval world depended on material control as much as swords or alliances. Economic sabotage also intersected with law. Courts could uphold property seizures, fines, or trade restrictions, giving revenge a veneer of legitimacy. The careful manipulation of legal and financial systems allowed punishing rivals without overt bloodshed while ensuring the outcome appeared lawful and justified. Ultimately, revenge through economic sabotage demonstrated an understanding of medieval society's foundations. Power was inseparable from wealth, and the destruction of economic stability could be more devastating than direct conflict. By striking at resources, rulers and nobles punished, humiliated, and controlled enemies, often leaving them weakened for life while the punisher consolidated their own strength.